everybody. Before I start, just a quick apology. Thursday afternoon, I started to lose my voice, and I woke up Friday morning, and every word was nothing but a squeak. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to talk on Monday. What am I going to do? So fortunately, it's past squeaking, but it's still a little rough, so please bear with me. So I'm with the Knot Worldwide. It's a company that celebrates life's milestones, from proposals and getting married to starting one's first home and starting a family. It has a portfolio of brands, including the Knot and WeddingWire, which are the largest wedding marketplaces in the US. We actually have brands across 15 different countries, and my team is responsible for the consumer lifecycle marketing, so email and push, for the WeddingWire brand, as well as our vendor communications and our global email operation. So we're in the process of standardizing email and consolidating email from all of our different countries to a team based in the US. So as an industry, we've been talking about personalization for years. And that's evolved from being the first name and the header of an email to really being true individual personalization. And things like predictive analytics and AI and machine learning have really dominated the conversations about how to achieve that one-to-one personalization, which we really kind of hold up as the gold standard. But I've seen a real shift in the past few years, which is really the technology backing it. So even just a few years ago, it was really complicated and really took a lot of resources to implement true one-to-one personalization at a large scale. But today, platforms, some of the new ones are actually built on personalization. Other platforms are adding features and tools to their set to make that a lot easier. So those things are accessible to a lot more teams. So today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to share some examples kind of across 3 different approaches to personalization. So one is predictive analytics and getting to that one-to-one personalization. The others are data-driven, so kind of like first name, but just playing on some different data points to put data directly in messaging. And then also rules and logic, so really kind of coming down to segmentation. Because I think when we're talking about personalization, we do sometimes get caught up in the fancier side of it because it's fun, it's new, it's different, it's interesting, but there's still a lot of power in segmentation, and particularly now getting into microsegmentation. So I'm going to share some examples, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're achieving it. Talking about the data, which of course is the foundation, and then talking about getting the right people in place. So this first example is a message that we send to users who have engaged with our checklist tool. So on the WeddingWire site, we have an entire suite of tools about budget planning, about your guest list, about your seating chart. One of them is the checklist tool. So what we do is if a user has engaged with the checklist, but they haven't engaged with it for the past 21 days, then we send this message. So it's really microsegmentation. And then the other piece of this is the checklist items in the message are actually given to us by our data science team. So they're using predictive analytics to determine the next 3 checklist items. And that's based on activities that the user has taken as well as where they are in their wedding planning cycle. And when we did this, we actually just started this message a few months ago. And we started it with a nice clean A/B split. We took a cohort where we did not send the message to them, and then, of course, sent the message to the other group. And we saw a 47% improvement in engagement with that checklist tool. So this is actually one in a series of messages. We're looking across our product at all the different data points we have, at all the different interactions that somebody has with the product. And it's almost kind of like cart abandonment. So, what are the interactions that people are taking with your product where there's some indication that they've stopped along that journey? And how do you get them re-engaged again? Now, one of the pitfalls with this particular approach is it is microsegmentation. It can end up being very small groups. That's certainly one of the challenges that comes into personalization. So when we started this initiative, we actually identified all those data points, all the opportunities, and then we estimated out average monthly volume for every point. And there were some that we knew would work really well, but the volume just wasn't big enough to have a significant business impact, so we had to let those go. So pitfall number 1, too much work for too little impact. So really thinking about measuring the opportunity up front. The other one, so we ran into this with this message. We work with another team on our copy. And from the email team perspective, we kind of shared some copy points that we wanted. We actually originally intended to include like the last updated date in the message. We're like, we know what you're doing, so let's tell you. And our copy team was concerned about it being a little bit creepy, so we had to have some conversations about where that line is. But the copy that came back originally could have spoken to anybody, any one of our users about the checklist tool. So we really had to go back to them and say, no, we need to speak to these people in a more personal way. We know they engage with the tool, and the copy has to reflect that. So really, when you're thinking about the copy, just are you being specific to the data that you have about it? Are you really playing on that? So this next message, also using predictive analytics. So this is one of the messages in our welcome series. And we did a test. The message on the left talks about our vendor directory. It's a very general message, go find your vendors. On the message on the right, we added specific vendor listings. They were provided by our data science team. And we saw the improvement in lead conversion go up by 42%. So really huge lift, driving leads to our vendors. And just for context, when I talk about leads, I'm talking about couples requesting information from vendors. That is our primary goal for the email channel. So seeing that go up by 42% is a really big improvement for us. One of the pitfalls here is low quality recommendations. So I think sometimes we can get caught up in the buzzword, and it's predictive analytics, it must be good. But we can't rely on that. We've got to prove it, right? And there's a lot of ways that low quality can come into recommendations. So it can certainly be the algorithm. So test different algorithms, what's working better. One of the specific issues that we faced is that we initially actually didn't have enough recommendations from our data science team. So we were getting about 5 recommendations for each user in the database. But we wanted to include recommendations in more messages. I mean, when it drives the conversion rate up that much, you want to do it more, right? So we had to work with them to get a bigger list per user, because what we didn't want to do is basically serve the same recommendations again and again. So we started getting more recommendations, and then we also put in place a feedback loop. So we started returning to our data science team which recommendations a user had been served and whether or not they had opened the email with those recommendations. And now the data science team takes that information into consideration to modify their recommendations for that. This message is actually one of my favorites. It's our monthly countdown. We've actually had it for a long time, but we revamped it a couple of months ago. At the top of the message, we're just using direct data. So we're feeding back to people. We call this our dashboard. What is the last category they searched for? How many vendors have they contacted? How many vendors have they booked? We're also using weeks to wedding information, so we know the wedding date for everybody. And we're dropping in editorial based on that wedding date. We're also pulling in recent forum posts. We're pulling in those same vendor listing recommendations provided by the data science team. And we're also using regional information to pull in what's called a real wedding. So it's just a gallery of photos around a real wedding in the user's region. So this definitely led to a more personalized message, more up to date, since we always have like the recent forum posts and things of that nature. But really the real win here was operational efficiency. So the entire message is dynamic. When you look at this message in the system, it's pretty ugly. It's nothing but script. And what that allowed us to do is this was originally a series of 12 messages. And the email specialist who built this message actually took it from 12 to 17 in a matter of about 2 weeks. So we were actually capturing a much larger portion of our audience, and we were able to increase leads from this particular series by about 25%. Not only that, given another couple of weeks, she was actually able to take the entire 17 message series and roll it out to 3 more countries. And it was possible to move that quickly up at the end because she had put in the work up front. It was all dynamic, it's all based on the data, and we had that data structure in place for all those countries. So it's really just operational efficiency and a win there just in terms of speed and agility. One of the challenges with this message, and this is one that we're still working on, is in the top, that dashboard piece, we're feeding back to users their specific activity. If a user is not interacting with us, then that data isn't going to update over time. So that's something that we have to take into consideration and account for. We don't want to show them the same information again and again. So that's when we need to figure out when is that data point no longer useful and when do we take it out of the message. So dynamic data over time, one of the pitfalls. So as your data is changing, as time changes, as user changes, are you keeping that in mind and adjusting your message to account for that? So this particular message, we call it our vendor category series. One of our goals is to get users to submit leads to multiple categories. So let's see. From primarily a couple of different categories. And so we're trying to get them to go into those other categories. So to build awareness, make sure they're aware of it, and then request those leads. And we actually send this message to 2 different groups. So the first one is people who have searched for that specific category. So this is the wedding cake message. So if they've searched for bakers, then we send out this message the following week. Our second group is actually based on weeks to wedding. The performance on that particular message is a lot lower because it's not based on that user-specific activity. But the important piece here is that we don't have all the information we want on every single user. And we still have to address people who are less active. Because for most companies, certainly for ours, it's too big of a segment of our group to ignore. So we have to figure out ways to take whatever data we do know and send to them. And this is a message that we're playing with right now. We're playing with when to send the message. We're also playing with sending like multiple categories at once to see if we can get somebody to engage so that we can then bounce off of the click. But don't ignore your dormant users. There is opportunity there. So the pitfall, only talking to the converted. So what is your plan for talking to the people who are less active, the ones who have a bit less data? The second challenge with this particular message is that when a user signs up for the WeddingWire site, we require them to put in a wedding date. Super useful from the email perspective. We base a lot of messages on that date. The issue is that when people sign up, they may not even be engaged yet. They may just know that they're getting married next year. Maybe they just know that they're getting married in the fall. So a lot of times the wedding date we get actually isn't a very reliable data point. So we do use it a lot. It's the date that we have. But we have to do so knowing that there's a good chance that it's not actually right for that user. And we're working on finding better ways to sense when that data is different. So looking for cues in the user's activity to know that we need to adjust our messaging to a different date than what they've provided. So pitfall is relying on unreliable data, and I think the important thing there is understanding when it's unreliable. So I'm going to keep talking about dormant users for a minute. So we're actually spending a lot of time really around getting to personalized frequency. And right now we're focused particularly on that dormant segment and trying to understand when shouldn't we send them the messages and which messages might they respond to. And the reasons we want to do this, some conversations in the company have been like, well, just send it to them. You'll get something out of it. So we've had conversations about deliverability and what that does for deliverability. We also want to waste money on the volume to dormant. It is inexpensive. That's not a primary factor for us, but it is something we want to keep in mind. That's a large group for you. It can certainly add up to a significant business expense. And really, the one that I think is most important is want to see if there's an opportunity to actually re-engage dormant users. So we have a pretty high frequency. For our active users, we are sending 15 to 20 messages per month. So we want to understand, like for those dormant users, if we back off of that, are they more likely to get engaged? So we're using the predictive intelligence feature within our platform. It assigns an engagement persona to our audience. So we have our loyalists who have a high open and a high click-through rate, our selective shoppers who have a low open but high click rate, window shoppers with a high open and low click, and our dormant users with a low open and a low click. So our dormant users is what we were focused on for this particular project. So we started suppressing them from this particular message goes 2 weeks before a wedding. It provides editorial content around what not to pack on your honeymoon. And what we found is when we started suppressing the dormant users, the click-through rate went up by 70%. This sounds really good. It's a big improvement, right? The issue with that is our click volume went down by 14%. So for this particular message, that was actually fine. It was not one of our primary goals. But I can tell you, if we saw a 14% drop in leads from a message, it would be a really big issue. So I think one of the pitfalls is actually too much focus on open and click rate. So the thing to keep in mind here is for us, we actually have quite a good inbox placement rate. We're sitting at 97 to 98%. So we didn't have a problem there that we were trying to solve. We weren't concerned about the budget. What we don't know yet, because we haven't done enough testing, is whether or not backing off that frequency will get those dormant users to re-engage. But with this in mind, when it comes to our messages that are driving leads, we're not going to take a 14% drop in leads in order to get that increase in click-through rate. So this particular message, also based on rules and logic, really easy to implement. There's nothing fancy about it. This is promoting our wedding website, so couples can create their own website to talk about their event and the venue and show their registry. And it's going to 2 sets of users. We're sending it to users who have clicked on a link about wedding websites in a previous message, but haven't set up their website. And then we're also sending it to users who have told us that they've booked their venue. So once somebody's booked their venue, the location's down, the date is set, it's time for them to start sending their save the date messages, start pulling together their invitations, and it's time for them to start building their wedding website. So really narrowing down on that timing. And this message is really similar. This is our one of our registry messages. The way the registry works is that users go to their retailer, so it might be Target or Wayfair or Amazon. And once they've started their registry, they can actually import it into their WeddingWire registry to show on their wedding website. So we know when a user has clicked out to one of those retailers, and if they haven't actually followed through with importing into their WeddingWire registry. So we trigger this message to get them to complete that process. So again, it's kind of like the first message, sort of like cart abandonment, just applied to a different action. So the pitfall here, not following up with your hot prospects. So where are the holes in your funnel? So in your experience with your product, what are all the different interactions, and what are the holes where people are starting an action and not following through, and are you sending the message at the right time to get them back in that loop? So this message is sent to users who have submitted a lead to a caterer. It's offering some editorial about when you contact your caterer, what questions do you need to ask? It's actually one of a series. We also send follow-ups for venues and photographers. And one of the things about this message is we actually don't promote our vendor listings, and that's a very specific decision. They've already contacted vendors. We don't want to interfere with that conversation that we're having. But it's actually one of our top performing messages. So in spite of not having that direct call to action, we see high engagement because we're providing that value through the editorial. We actually see high conversion as well to the leads. So I think one of the things here that's important is this kind of message helps us maintain an engagement with subscribers, helps us keep them engaged because we're providing that value. So as you look across your program, we all have things that we need to ask for from our subscribers, but at what points are you offering value? And what opportunity do you have to give back to your subscriber in order to maintain that engagement? So this message is about new reviews. We have a couple of different ways we send it out. So when a vendor gets a new review on the site, we send a message to all the users who have saved that vendor. And we also send a message to the users who have viewed that vendor in the last 14 days. Excuse me. So this is actually, again, about providing value. It's a high-performing message because reviews are one of the main ways that users make their decisions about vendors. Thank you so much. So reviews are one of the main ways that couples are making their decisions. So again, we're back to providing value, and again, a high-performing message. So as you look across your products, your catalog, what are the different things that are happening that you can use to trigger a message that provides new information to users? So another reason to contact people with a message that's a little bit different. So this message is promoting hotels. Again, back to timing. So this is sent after a user has booked their venue, and we're showcasing hotels that are near the venue that they've booked. So this is a particular product where people can actually set up their guest accommodation. So this is actually affiliate revenue for us. So again, it's back to timing and in a way providing value as well. This message is about getting reviews for photographers. So we send it to newlyweds. It's sent about 60 days after the wedding. So we know about when couples get back their photos from the wedding. So back to timing, it's a micro segment. And if we know the photographer that they've booked, we drop that name in there. We see for the users that have told us which photographer we booked, that's really where we're seeing the conversion. We do send it to the rest of users as well. We see a little bit less interaction with that message. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make this happen, talking about the data as well as getting the right people in place. So the first piece of data, and this has already come up today, is systems integration. I think this is one of the biggest challenges. We have a lot of different platforms in place. We're trying to get data from a lot of different systems. And it's actually been interesting. So I've been with WeddingWire about 1.5 years. And in December, we actually merged with our biggest competitor, which is the Knot. And so the merger has actually gone really well, and it's been a fascinating opportunity to see how different businesses in the same industry with the same business model just do things differently. So on the Knot side, we actually have a variety of different marketing platforms that have API integrations directly into the marketing platform. So they're managing a number of different discrete data integrations. One of the advantages of this approach is the integration gives them more real-time data. One of the disadvantages is the data team has to manage all these separate API calls and maintain them over time. On the WeddingWire side, we're actually doing those integrations to a data warehouse. And then the data warehouse is actually being used to output the data that we need for the marketing platform. And true confession time, most of that data is being passed with flat files delivered to an FTP server. And when I was thinking about this, I'm like, I don't want to tell anybody that. It should all be API calls. But we actually did a pretty extensive audit. We actually talked to an outside consultant. And for our particular setup, we're passing a pretty significant amount of data. Most of that data is only available once a day. And actually, the flat files are really just the better way to go. So we occasionally run into delays and things that create a snowball effect. But overall, the system actually works really well for us. So it sounds sort of outdated, but it works. I think in the end, we're going to end up with some hybrid. So there are some data points that we would like to have more real-time access to. We need to get API integrations in place for those data points. But I think a hybrid approach in the end is actually going to work really well. The other piece is data architecture and data integrity. So over the past year, our dev and product team actually did a lot of work on the back end. And one of the outcomes of that is actually a whole entirely new database, which meant all the data fields changed, the data tables changed. So we actually took that opportunity to audit all of our data that was being passed into the system, re-architected all of the tables. So we actually started, prior to that process, there were about 800 data points that were being passed on a daily basis. After we did our audit, we actually got that down to about 400 data points. And that was purely about reconsidering how the related tables were structured. So there was a lot of redundant data, a lot of things that we were able to use lookups for and use related tables for. So at the end of the day, we actually then added more data to it. So we came out of this process with more data than we had before. On a daily basis, we're passing about 570 data points. It includes the obvious stuff like email address and first name. But we're also passing things like, what is the last time that a user logged into the site? Have they downloaded the app, and which iOS did they use to download the app? When did they last log into the app? Those data points are spread across 40 tables, and then we're integrating those for 15 different countries. So the way we have our system set up is we use Salesforce Marketing Cloud, and it's split into what's called business units. So we've chosen to manage each country separately so that we can maintain a discrete database for each country. And then we're also able to share data across all those business units. So we've got a nice combination of discrete data and shared data. And one of the things for us, for some countries or some brands, like if you're something like Nike, you have the same brand across the world. For us, we actually have a different brand in every country. So it's the same back end. We can run the same programs, but it's actually a different brand. So this really helps us maintain that discrete database. Another thing about data architecture, something that we did in the audit was to standardize. So when you're looking at your field name, first name is not first name is not first. And this happens. This is the reality, right? Because as different people set up different things over time, they tend to set it up the way that is in their mind if there's not standards in place. So this can create a real issue. So what was happening for my team is when we were writing SQL queries, every time we wrote it, we had to look at the table to figure out how the data field was written for that particular table. So it's really a waste of time. So we went through and we standardized the field names. We standardized all the table names and all the file names. Another thing that we were running into is data types, so another place to standardize. So to give an example there, our user IDs, the unique ID for each customer, is a number. But we're not doing calculations with that number. We're using it as a string. And some people were putting it in as text, and some people were putting it in as a number. So then when we were writing our queries, all of a sudden we were getting errors because the data types didn't line up. So it's just another place that it's not necessarily top of mind until you run into the problem. So if you think about it up front and put those standards in place, it can save you a lot of time in the long run. And third, data quality. I already heard somebody say it today, garbage in, garbage out. I'm fortunate to be in a place where we have some good data hygiene practices in place. It's a big data company. But this is a huge issue for a lot of people. And if you don't have good quality data, then there's really nothing you can do with it. So what I encourage you to do is, if you're in that situation, find a way to become a part of the conversations about when the data is collected. Let people know that email is a stakeholder in that data. The other aspect is the right people and the right teams. First being organizational buy-in. So I'm also very fortunate to be at a place where the organization believes in email as a channel. Our CMO knows the power of email, and it helps us get the resources that we need. One of the things that we do to help foster that buy-in is that we make sure when we're talking about metrics, we are aligned with the business goals. So we very rarely report things like open rate and click rate outside of the email team. So we have trained the organization to recognize those engagement metrics as health metrics. They're the things that the email team uses to diagnose problems with their underlying fundamental business goals. So we track, for example, leads. We track how many websites we're driving. We track how many registries people are starting. Those are the same metrics that the rest of the company is tracking. So I think that's a really important component to getting that organizational buy-in, because then you can really demonstrate how the channel is supporting the business. Secondly is strong networks. So we rely on a lot of other teams, obviously the data team. We're also relying on our creative team for graphics, for copy. We work with a number of different stakeholders across consumer marketing and e-commerce. So having those strong relationships allows us to have conversations about how to effectively use email. It gives us a voice in the conversation. So because of those networks, the email team is brought in at the beginning of a project to show how email can support it. So strong networks are really important. And third, well-rounded team. So there are a lot of different ways to successfully run an email team. One that I feel very passionately about is having a team that has both the technical skills as well as the marketing skills. And I really believe that because of the technical skills that my team has, they are better able to recognize the marketing opportunities because they know what's possible. So my team, for example, they do code HTML, they write SQL queries. They can also lay out a marketing program. So if they know what program they need to support and what the goal is, they can certainly lay out which messages and determine timing and things of that nature. So really a strong combination of technical skills and marketing skills. And when you're trying to build your team, I think one of the qualities that is really important is curiosity. So if you're hiring curious people, they're going to be interested in solving problems and looking at things new ways. And when new things come out, they're going to be interested in chasing that because they're naturally curious. So to wrap things up, I am a list person, so I couldn't resist just wrapping up with a list. So a few things that you might want to consider doing once you get home. So one is auditing your customer journey. What are the different points along that journey that you can inject an email to get someone to take the next step? Think about the tone of your messaging. So we talked about copy that was unspecific, but also consider how do you make it personal. And authenticity is really becoming another buzzword in the marketing industry. And authenticity is difficult to maintain when you're talking about automation. So how do you use the tone of your messaging to be personal and authentic? Make a plan for communicating with dormant users. So for most businesses, it's a really big segment. It's too big to ignore. There is value there. So what are you doing to figure out how to communicate with those users? Fully use the features and tools included with your platform. So particularly if you are on a platform that has regular releases, in the busyness of day-to-day, it can be really easy to, you see it, it's like, well, I'll get to it later. But make sure that you're really using all the functionality that you have. And find those curious team members and give them an opportunity to explore something and present it to your team. So review your data structure. A lot of inefficiencies, a lot of time wasted can happen if your data architecture is not good. So really re-examine your data architecture and see if there are places that you need to standardize or re-architect. And last, build your team's skill set and seek out curious people. There's people who are going to solve problems and figure out different ways to do things. So thank you so much for letting me share with you today, and thank you for bearing with my voice.
Heather, thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna spare this poor woman's voice. She's done yeoman's work. She's going to be running the roundtable at the end of the morning. So if you have follow-up questions for Heather, you can save it for then.